So we just talked about what a macromolecule is, right? And it is a polymer that is made up of at least two or more monomers that have combined together to make these larger molecules. And these larger molecules, there's four of them in the human, or in all life, not just the human body. We have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So we're going to start today talking about the first of those, which are carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, you're probably all very familiar with carbs. They are things like, for example, sugars, starches, fiber, grains, roughage. But all of that really is sugar. Sugar is what we run off of. So think about a car. You guys probably are getting your licenses soon if you don't already have it. And you know that you have to put gas in your car. And that car runs off of that gas. The gas gets burned by the engine and the pistons go up and down and it makes the wheels turn. Well, that is really kind of how our body works as well. That's how life works. You need energy for movement. You can't have movement without it. So our energy source is going to be glucose or other types of sugars as well, but carbohydrates in general. So what is the job or the function of your carbohydrates? Well, we use them for the very short term. You can see I wrote short term here. Short-term storage and release of energy. You've all felt a sugar crash before, right? If you were to eat a bag of candy right now, you'd all get super hyper and then you would get very tired. And that is because you've used up all that energy, your energy spiked, and it actually has to do with something called insulin, which we're not going to really talk about in this class, but you probably heard of insulin before. Your body just starts to take all that sugar back in because it thinks it needs it for later, and you end up crashing. So, but glucose and sugar in general is what makes your body run. It is the fuel source. What elements are found in carbohydrates? Well, carbohydrates are made up of three specific elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they actually have a special ratio in which you can find them. They're always going to be found in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. So I want to take a minute and explain what that all means. So let's take a look here. First off, let's look at the word carbohydrate. Carbohydrate can actually be broken into two parts. We have carbo and we have hydrate, right? So carbo hopefully makes you think of carbon, which is what the word comes from. And then hydrate makes you think of, hopefully, hydration makes you think of water, and water is made up of two elements, hydrogen and oxygen. So carbohydrates, the name tells you exactly what it's made of. So if you forget, just think of those words, carbohydrate. And they're found in a ratio, like I said, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So let me explain what that means. If I say ratio, if you don't know what ratio means, it just means comparing one thing to another. So if I want to know the ratio of teachers to students in the class, I would count up the number of teachers and I would count up the number of students. So it's usually, like in the case of this class, it's 1 to around, let's say 24, because this is for all my periods. So some of my classes are bigger than others. But let's say 1 to 24. That means for every one teacher, there are 24 students. So what does that mean? If I add 2 teachers, I have to then increase this to 48, right? Because that ratio stays the same. It's a 1 to 2 ratio here. So 1 to 24, if I increase it, you would see it increase like that. But that's not the ratio for carbohydrates. The ratio for carbohydrates is 1 to 2 to 1. One of the more common examples of a carbohydrate is glucose. And glucose has the chemical formula of C6H12O6. And what that means is for every 6 carbons, there's going to be 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. So if I were to draw out a glucose molecule, it looks like this. So you can see it over here. If I were to count up all these elements, I would find there are 6 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And there are 12 hydrogens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and there are 6 oxygens. And you can, I'm not actually counting them, I'm just doing it as a reference here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, right? Because if I divide all these by 6, what I get is 1, 2 to 1. So for example, this element, this compound, I should say, molecule even, is a carbohydrate. And I know because it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So would this be a carbohydrate? The answer to that question would be no, because it's not a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So one of the things you need to know is that carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So just make sure you're aware of that. Okay, let's get back to those notes real quick, and then we will finish up this lecture. Okay. So let's talk a little more about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have something called building blocks, which are monomers. And monomers combine together to make polymers. And there's actually 3 examples that we're going to talk about here. We have a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, and a polysaccharide. Saccharide just means sugar. That's what it means. So saccharide means sugar. Mono means 1, di means 2, and poly means many. So a monosaccharide would be a simple sugar or a single sugar molecule. So it is made up of a bunch of elements. It's made up of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. But a single sugar by itself would be an example of a monomer or a monosaccharide. If I take 2 of those monosaccharides and combine them together, I get something called a disaccharide. And an example of that would be sucrose, which you all have used before. If you go into your cabinet right now and find sugar, that white sugar, that is sucrose. That's all it is sucrose. And what it is it's a combination of 2 monosaccharides called glucose and fructose. And they combine via anybody know? A condensation reaction, right? So the way you combine elements together, monomers together, is you have to remove a water molecule, and that is called a condensation reaction. And then if I want to get real fancy, I have a polysaccharide. And a polysaccharide is made up of 3 or more monosaccharides put together. And these are called complex carbohydrates. These are the ones that tend to be better for you because your body digests them a little slower and they release their energy in a more reasonable time frame. Examples would be starch, cellulose, and glycogen. So starch is how plants store their food energy. So if plants make glucose, that's what they do. Their job is they make glucose, and that's photosynthesis. And then we eat that glucose. But plants also eat that glucose, and if they have extra, they store it as starch. Plants also use that sugar, that polysaccharide, to make cellulose. And cellulose is what's in plant cell walls. So you probably remember back to 7th grade and learning about cells, and you probably learned that plant cells are different than animal cells, and one of the main reasons is because plant cells have cell walls. It's why plants can grow tall. Well, they have a sugar in there called cellulose, and what cellulose does is it acts like bricks in the wall, and it makes them strong, so that basically it gives structure to the cell walls. And then finally, glycogen is how we store our sugar in our muscles. So when you have a lot of sugar, and also in our liver, when you eat a lot of sugar and you don't use it right away, your body stores it 2 ways. One way, it stores it as fat, but it also stores it as something called glycogen. And glycogen you can use when you need it. So let's say you don't eat for a couple hours, your body can use that glycogen for energy. So let me just explain this a little bit better, and then we'll be done with this lesson. So let's take a look over here at our sugar molecules. So this would be an example of glucose. And glucose is a monosaccharide. So this would be a monosaccharide because it's made up of a single sugar. And you'll notice that sugar have this ring-shaped structure, and that's because that's how they form. They're this ring structure. So a single sugar would be a monosaccharide, and an example would be glucose. A disaccharide would be if I took 2 of these sugar molecules and put them together, and they're going to form a bond. But one thing you'll notice is they don't want to match up. So what I would need to do is I would need to remove a water. So if I were to remove a water molecule here, if I were to take away an H2O, what that would do is it would allow those 2 to form together, and hopefully you remember that is called a condensation reaction. So this would be a disaccharide, and disaccharides are really just 2 monosaccharides added together. If I want to make this into a polysaccharide, all I have to do is, you guessed it, add 1 more sugar. So it would have to also, just like before I just did, it's going to have to lose a water molecule because it's a condensation reaction. So one of these water molecules is going to have to go away, and we're going to get a polysaccharide, which is made up of 2 or more. So in reality, they're very long. And these are going to give you things like starch, which is how plants store their energy. So think of that as the fat of a plant. So for example, a potato, like if I were to draw what a potato plant looks like, it looks something like this, right? You think of the thing underground, right? This lumpy guy here is the potato. That is filled with starch. But the actual potato plant, if you've ever seen a potato plant before, the plant grows above the ground. So you actually have to pull the plant out of the ground, and that's how you get to the potato. So when you eat a potato, you're basically eating the stored energy for that plant. Also, we have cellulose, which is what plants use to make their cell walls. That is another form of a polysaccharide. And then finally, we have glycogen. And glycogen is how we store our sugar. So if we don't use it right away, animals store it as glycogen. And that is all.